Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Gabriel Rosenfeld, the president here at the Center for Jewish History, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's book launch and conversation. I confess I'm an academic myself, so I'm very well aware of how important these events are. The hardest work of scholarly research, of course, takes place in solitude, both the research and the writing, and it takes place over the course of, in many cases, years. It's marked by many false starts, wrong turns, painful cuts before the final product, which we call a book, comes into the world. So, of course, the publication of any book is a very profound individual achievement, but it's also the product of many other contributors. Beyond the colleagues who provide useful feedback, the editors that all too often ask for revisions, and the marketing professionals that write blurbs, a scholarly book is, of course, shaped by the help and advice provided by also people who are always based here at this particular institution, the Center for Jewish History. Here I'm talking about the archivists and the librarians and the other research professionals. The Center for Jewish History was created nearly 25 years ago, and it's ever since played a very important role in the publication of literally scores of books whose authors have conducted research in our partners' archival collections. And Miriam's book, which we'll of course be hearing a lot about this evening, is a testament to that fact, and she can certainly communicate her appreciation of and dedication to the center in her remarks this evening. But more broadly in that context, I want to say just a couple of words of personal gratitude to Miriam. I'm in fact quite grateful that I've been her colleague, confidant, and friend over the past 2 years. We've worked very closely together on a wide range of projects and programs and initiatives, most notably the Jewish Comics Experience, which was Miriam's brainchild, and which will be taking place again this coming November 10th at the center. Miriam brings a great many skills to the table: creativity, flexibility, dedication, but tonight we're going to celebrate her independent achievement with the publication of her new book, Carrying a Big Schtick. So let me formally introduce both our speakers this evening. Miriam Mora serves as the academic director for the Center for Jewish History here in New York City. She is a historian of American immigration and ethnicity, and she has served as the inaugural historian in residence for the Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center at the New England Genealogical Historical Society, Marcus Center Fellow at the American Jewish Archives, and visiting scholar at CJH. As I mentioned, she's the co-creator of Juice, the Jewish Comic Experience, and her previously published works on anti-Semitism and contemporary politics and pop culture have appeared in such venues as the Washington Post, the Journal of Jewish Identities, and Journal of Feminist Studies in Religion. To her right is Ronnie Grinberg. She is Associate Professor of History and core faculty member of the Schusterman Center for Judaic and Israel Studies at the University of Oklahoma. Her research and teaching interests lie in the realm of 20th century America, American Jewish history, women's and gender history, intellectual history, and social movements. Her latest book, Write Like a Man, Jewish Masculinity and the New York Intellectuals, was published by Princeton University Press in March 2024. I think you can take for granted that both our discussants today have a lot in common with regard to today's topic, so I will turn it over to them.
Is it on? Yes. Thanks so much for joining us. It's such a pleasure and a treat to be here. I had been asked to read Miriam's book when it was in manuscript, so I had been hearing about Miriam for a really long time. I had to decline because my own book wasn't finished, and it took me a really long time to write that book. But it was nice to know that someone was working on the topic of American Jewish masculinity as well. And then when we finally met, it was like I had known Miriam for a really long time, and I think to have our books come out around the same time is pretty special and pretty awesome. So I am really touched and grateful to be here. I found Miriam's book to be such an important intervention and necessary book in American Jewish history. It's surprising. I mean, American Jewish masculinity as a topic is surprisingly understudied. I feel like we have lots of cultural references maybe to American Jewish masculinity, and maybe it's kind of been in the zeitgeist, but actual scholarly studies have been quite few. There was a couple good books that came out in the early 1990s. I'm thinking of Paul Bryan's Tough Jews, which is sort of a cultural study, but then very little until 2017 when Sarah Imhoff, who is an associate professor of religion at Indiana University, published a book called Masculinity and the Making of American Judaism. But she's a scholar of religion, and so she was really focused on Judaism and how Judaism kind of became a manly religion. And we didn't really have a book that talked about American Jewish masculinity in kind of a broad, covering a broad range of topics and sort of in big strokes. And Miriam's book is amazing for how much it covers in scope. It starts in the middle of the 19th century and it goes well until the 1960s. It is so well researched and written. I think that it is going to be the book that scholars will start with and have to contend with as they begin to write about this subject more. I think what her book does, besides giving kind of a broad overreach, or I don't know if that's the right word, but a broad lens for American Jewish masculinity in the 20th century, it also suggests like where there's areas that need more fruitful discussion. And so I think Sarah Imhoff quoted, she's quoted on the back of the book as a blurb, and I think she says, this is the book that we've been waiting for. And I think that's absolutely right. The other thing I will say about, as I was reading Miriam's book, I was struck with how transnational it is in scope. So while it's ostensibly a study about American Jewish masculinity, which it is, her knowledge of the historiography, of European history, of Zionism, of not just American Jewish history is evident. And throughout the book, she is not just talking about American Jewish masculinity, but she is linking it to other discourses. I feel like that's a fancy, annoying academic term, but discourses, other models of Jewish masculinity in other parts of the world. So when she talks about Zionism, she's talking about Palestine and then Israel. When she's talking about immigrants, she's looking back to Eastern Europe, to Central Europe, and how knowledgeable she is of that scholarship is clear in the book. So I would say that it's also impressive for how transnational it is. I'm trying to think if I have anything else here. It was reviewed really positively in Publishers Weekly. And Miriam and I have been joking a little bit because at one point the author said many amazing things, like it's a trenchant analysis, and it's a really important book. But she referred to the prose being tough sledding, which I think is something now Miriam might talk about that she wears with pride. But I'll say it's not really tough sledding. The first 3 chapters, maybe, where Miriam is trying to stake out not only her historical intervention, but her theoretical kind of background. There might be some academic terms that maybe are tough sledding, but as soon as you get into the middle of the 3rd chapter, and this book is 10 chapters long, it is beautiful prose, accessible, and easily written. So you might wear the tough sledding proudly, but I would just put a asterisk and be like, read the rest of the book, because that's not the case. So. That's all I'll say. Do you want to say anything? Or I should say a little bit about our format. So we're just going to have a conversation. And we also want to hear from you guys. So we're going to talk for maybe 30 minutes or so. I don't have a watch on, and I'm not going to look at my phone. So if I've already told people if we start to talk too long, let us know. But we're going to ask a couple questions and just sort of have a conversation. And then we're going to open it up to questions from you guys for the second half of the talk. Sound okay? And talking, you can hear me in the back, and hopefully not talking too fast. Okay, so Miriam, the first question I wanted to ask you, which I guess I talked a little bit about, but is there anything you want to add to what the book is about?
I feel like we can stop there for the night, and that's a great review. We can be done. But before I start answering, I want to thank you for coming in and doing this. There's no one better to be in discussion with, I think. Your books, I think, make a great conversation together, so I'm really excited for other people to read them as such. Ronnie's book will also be for sale after. And I want to thank my colleagues at the Center for Jewish History and Gav for that really, really nice introduction, and AJHS, where I did the bulk of my research here in the building, and the archivists who helped me through their staff and through our staff, and this is just an amazing place to do this kind of work. And that introduction was incredibly kind, thank you. And I've already forgotten what you asked me, sorry.
Well, I was going to ask, and I realized as I asked the question, I also didn't, well, what's the book about? If there's anything else you want to add, if you were to, tell the audience what this book is about.
So you touched on something very important in your introduction, which is that the work that had been done on Jewish masculinity, the scholarly work that's already been conducted, was largely out of Jewish studies and in media studies and pop culture. And so the goal I set out with was to create the historical framework for those analyses to take place in the future with more grounding in reality instead of just film and literature analysis. But I think what it grew into, and what the final product hopefully is really a story of the acculturation process for Jews as an immigrant community, and it demonstrates a kind of uphill and continuing struggle to fully acculturate, or in some cases very intentionally assimilate into mainstream American culture with both whiteness and masculinity as a constant impediment. So one of the kind of through lines of the book is the fact that anti-Semitism is in itself a very gendered prejudice. And so the process of acculturation for American Jews, this was one of the big issues, is whiteness and nationality and masculinity are so closely connected. And so it's a kind of constant uphill struggle, or I think, I say at one point, it's like, there are all these variant masculinities, and so studying Jewish masculinity is kind of like studying a braided and fraying twine. There's all these different threads to follow, but there's still kind of a through line and trajectory.
So one of the central arguments, and I can hear me, is that the process of acculturation, central to that process is achieving a masculinity that's seen as normative or seen as American. And so throughout this 20th century, Jews are striving in some ways to embody a masculinity that's seen as normative. Is it not? Oh, no, okay. Seen as normative, but because of things like anti-Semitism, and I think your observation about how gendered anti-Semitism is also one of the really rich, thorough lines of the book. So with that, I guess a first question would be is, if Jews were thought of as other in terms of gender, and I think you could make the argument before the middle of the 20th century, Jews were other in a lot of ways in the United States, that scholars have realized. They were other in terms of race. Jews weren't quite seen as white. Most scholars would I think accept that point, though it's complicated. Jews were seen as other in terms of a religion. Right, so we now think of the United States as, I don't know if now, but certainly around the middle of the 20th century, there was this idea that the United States was a tri-faith country, where there was a Judeo-Christian tradition. That is a construction that emerges during World War II. It did not exist prior to that. So Jews were also seen as other in terms of religion. Jews were, working class. Right after World War II, they become upwardly mobile and in many ways benefit from kind of being seen as white, moving into the suburbs, et cetera. But I think another overlooked process of Jewish acculturation is how they have been othered in terms of gender. And we've had a lot of scholarship sort of looking at Jewish women, but I think what's really profound and what's really important about your book is it shows how central ideas about masculinity are to acculturation. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about where the othering of Jews comes from, or sort of how some of the early kind of chapters of the book.
Yeah, so the book really begins with a chapter about perceptions of Jewish masculinity in Europe. Especially because I'm looking at it as an immigration historian, So I'm talking about notions of masculinity that were imported along with immigrants, not just Jewish immigrants, but immigrants from countries in Europe with Jews as well during the mass migration period. And in a lot of those places, particularly in Western Europe, Jews were outside of a whole lot more of mainstream society than they are in the United States. So arguably, Jews in the United States were given more access to mainstream American society than anywhere they had been prior. And one of the ways that they were kept out of society in Europe was being kept out of government roles, high-ranking military positions, or in some places military at all, which during an age of nationalism is an incredibly important connection to the state, land ownership, participation in education and universities and athletic societies and all kinds of things like that. And when they come to the United States, the hope is that they'll be able to access all of these institutions and rights here. But what they import with them is these assumptions that developed after generations of being barred from participation in those things in Europe. Like, for example, Jews were barred from military service, and therefore there was this assumption that Jews were cowardly because they didn't serve in the military. And that became an ongoing trope and an ongoing part of accusations against Jews in anti-Semitic rhetoric, but in Jewish rhetoric as well. And the same thing, I think...
It was internalized, right? So even immigrants themselves sort of carried these ideas and saw America as kind of a place where maybe they could transcend those ideas.
Yeah, a lot of the things that were imported, like I talk about agriculture in one of the early chapters, and Jews weren't landowners in most of Europe, and they didn't work the land. So it became a trope that Jews were unwilling to work the land or incapable of working the land. And when they came to the United States, that's not the profession that they tended to go into. They tended to congregate in cities and kind of, maintain the careers and lifestyles that they had had. But what's interesting is that they had internalized so much of this that Jewish culture had developed largely around it. So, the idea of becoming agriculturalists was not appealing. Just like other, I don't want to leave women out of the conversation either. Gender roles were different for Jews, for men and women. As men were, a lot of women were in breadwinning roles in Jewish families, and men were, if they were successful, more studious and more scholarly. And so women it was their job to run the household, bring in the income, run the shop. And when they came to the United States, the cult of domesticity, during the mass migration period had already become the norm. So Jewish women were also seen as outside of the norm in that way. But that had become very much a part of Jewish culture.
Right, and the cult of domesticity is sort of this 19th century idea that emerges with industrialization that separates the home from where the place of work is. And so the private sphere becomes the area where the woman supposedly is responsible and has authority. But that is just, that's basically motherhood and child rearing, and all economic work and jobs come part of the public sphere that men are leaving to do their work. And so when Jewish immigrants come, it was very different in Eastern Europe because women were always economic agents.
And a lot of things came along with that in Jewish culture, like, there was a book in, I think it was 1997, Daniel Boyarin published a book called Unheroic Conduct, which talked about how Jews hadn't just internalized this perception of Jewish men as being incapable or weak or unwilling, but had embraced it as an entirely different form of masculinity, which he called gentle Jewish masculinity. And I think we see that.
Scholar at one point, right? He reclaims the term sissy as being kind of a gentler, less macho Jewish masculinity that wasn't something that was anti-Semitic, but something that Jews developed and could be proud of.
Yeah, he argued that it was a Talmudic tradition, that centuries, millennia of Jewish history, since the rabbinic tradition had started, had really guided Jewish men into this different vein of masculinity. And I think one of the things that I do in the book is to demonstrate that wasn't universally loved or universally hated. That Jews, especially as, and I think it's important to say this, and I probably should have at the outset, this book really focuses on upwardly mobile, acculturating, middle class, largely Ashkenazi Jews. And that's a really important distinction. Otherwise, first of all, I've left out a huge amount of Jewish people and tradition and culture. But also, we're looking specifically at this intentional adaptation of Jewish life and Jewish manhood. So that's the kind of swath we're looking at. And that leaves out the ultra-Orthodox, it leaves out Mizrahi and Sephardi Jews largely, and focuses on those who believe that they are capable and have access to mainstream or hegemonic white American masculinity. So, yeah.
Keeps going, there we go. So some of the chapters that I found most fascinating in the book come in the middle, where you talk a little bit, two things. One is World War I and World War II, and how sort of transformative those wars are towards Jewish ideas, or to ideas about masculinity and Jews' achievement of it. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more. First of all, I found the discussion of World War I fascinating, because I have read very little on American Jews in World War I. So that might be something. But then we can move into thinking about how World War II in some ways functions as a real watershed. Not just in your, I mean, 20th century American Jewish history broadly, I would say World War II is a watershed. It's like a transformative moment for the American Jewish community. Maybe talk about that. I'm gonna add one more question because I feel like it's related, but you can do any one, which is another thing Miriam has an excellent analysis of Zionism in the book. And one of the things that I found surprising was how influential Zionist conceptions of Jewish masculinity were on the American Jewish community, dating back to the early 20th century. And they're kind of all intertwined, so answer them in whatever order or however you want.
Yeah, so I agree that I hadn't read very much. I hadn't read enough on Jews in World War I and how influential participation in the war from an American perspective really was.
Is there a lot written?
There's not. Jessica Cooperman has done some good work. But I think one of the reasons it's such a fascinating, I think it's really fascinating, focus is that there were it was a transformative moment for Jewish masculinity in terms of participation in the military. Because there were those assumptions that were brought from Europe and had really established themselves in American culture about Jewish cowardice, Jewish meekness, Jews as scholars, Jews as unathletic, and what I call the pervasive myth of Jewish evasion. They were so prominent that they showed up in places like the Army Medical Advisory Board. So there was a statement that said that the foreign-born were more apt, more prone to malingering, and Jews specifically most among them. And when this came out, the Jewish community got very upset about it, but the people who really got upset about it were the Jewish War Veterans, which is an organization that's been around since, I think, just before the turn of the century. And they came out and were this incredibly active voice throughout the First and Second World War in kind of shooting down this narrative. They were the first to collect real numbers about Jewish participation to show that Jews were disproportionately represented in the military, and they were constantly putting out, pamphlets and information with numbers about how many Jews had already died, and how many more had bravely fought than as was disproportionate to their percentage of the American population. And they did get, that medical advisory board statement was withdrawn and struck down, and they petitioned a number of politicians to come out and make statements about Jewish participation in the military, and they made some real progress in the First World War. And I think that's, part of it is hinged on how much the First World War in America, and I think around, the global north, really changed perceptions of masculinity on the whole. Because the First World War, it was the most, mechanized war, but it also, after the war, people really focused on veterans as heroes. A whole wave of literature came out, and this really masculine connection to nation and nationhood was very solidified.
No, no, I'm listening.
Zionism also really changes during this point in terms of its influence on American Jews. So American Jews were always very split about support of the Zionist movement, which I argue was a masculine movement from its very inception.
And you're not the only one. Lots of people have, I mean, just to say that it's not something, I mean, it's a big literature.
Yeah. One of the things I talk about is Theodore Herzl's kind of constant struggle to attain Austrian and German cultural masculinity through dueling societies and fraternities, things like that. But so much of it was about that kind of shedding the weak Jewish image, and American Jews feeling like they had attained more of that than their European brethren and other Jews around the world didn't feel they had to participate in that as universally as a lot of others did. But but after the First World War, when Jews really begin entering more visible professions and politics and becoming even more successful and notable, anti-Semitism also rises dramatically. The number of anti-Semitic groups in the country like triples or something like that. And so the interwar period, you have these new perceptions of masculinity and also new waves of anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism, I've said, it's gendered. But I think that one of the things that I hope that this book contributes is that when you look at any anti-Semitic rhetoric, if you think about it in gendered terms, it's very targeted. So accusations of Jewish malevolence, conspiracy theories, things like that, they're almost always directed at Jewish men and certain types of behavior that are ascribed to Jewish manhood. And I think the same is true of assumptions about Jews in things like military and all of this, is that it's all very kind of targeting that. And when it depicts women, it's equally gendered and focused.
So I was just thinking of, there's a quote I think about, well, we didn't talk about this, but about World War I, that it was a war that was, I'm not remember, but basically that it was looked upon as something to prove your manhood before. But afterwards, it was sort of hated because there was like a lot of disappointment with the mass killings in World War I. And I just wonder if some ways maybe the Jewish contribution and the way in which they masculinized during that war somehow got forgotten or overlooked, partly because of the regret that so much of like the literature on the First War focused on kind of how it was this devastating war that just caused this mass deaths, and it was, at least for the American contribution, for nothing. But so that just was a thought.
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna jump kind of parallel to it and talk about the Jewish Legion a little. So one of the things I talk about is before America joined the war, Jews were eager American Jewish men were eager to join the war and fight. And one of the reasons behind that is that so many of them had connections to the European theater. Because we're talking about the children of immigrants and immigrants themselves. And the ways that they were able to join the fight were varied. Some of them still had dual citizenship. But before America officially entered the war, Americans were allowed to go join and fight elsewhere. And there was a Jewish Legion that was formed through the British military, which was fighting on the front in Mandate Palestine. And they had begun recruiting earlier on in the war, I think in 1915 or 16, and then by 1917 had all of these international Jewish volunteers who had made their way from the United States through Canada, through training camps, and joined and were fighting in Palestine. And I think those are some of the most interesting stories from that period that I was looking at, because they were so clearly driven by their experiences in America and their experiences with kind of anti-Semitic rhetoric about their own manliness. So they had this opportunity to go and prove themselves. And so there are all of these accounts of young Jewish men standing on street corners and calling out to Jewish kids and saying, "Hey, do you want to prove you're a man? Come come fight for the British Army, come fight for the Jews. And it was a really kind of unique moment because once America had joined the war, Americans couldn't join up and fight for anyone else at that point. So then they joined the American military and are more like part of the crowd.
But they were sort of, they did it earlier and they were enthusiastic to do it,
Yeah.
which I found surprising in your story and thinking about World War I. So how about World War II? Let's talk a little bit about how World War II functions as kind of a watershed or this sort of pivotal moment in your story of American Jewish masculinity and acculturation.
So one of the things that I talk about throughout is these archetypes that people ascribe to Jewish men. So in the earlier part of the century, I talk a lot about the scholar, the Jew as scholar and as, kind of not a prime physical specimen. And one thing I want to say is this is all rhetoric. This isn't reality. That's really what I had set out to actually write about, is that these assumptions are written about as though they're fact. In the cultural studies that I've read, like in Paul Brynäs's wonderful book and lots of others, Warren Rosenberg too, it's, Jews were more scholarly, Jews were less physically developed. And one of the things I found is that that's just not true. And Jews are people like everybody else, but that these assumptions are prevalent.
Yeah, and you have conversations about Jewish crime and gangsters, sort of toughness, and about Jewish camping movements and fraternities and athletes in your earlier chapter, showing that there's multiple models of kind of Jewish masculinity.
The book covers a lot. But the Second World War presents new archetypes. So one of the things that happens at the end of the First World War is that myth of Jewish evasion from military service kind of dies down.
Which is amazing.
Yeah, it is. And a lot of that is due to the Jewish war veterans and how much information they're really putting out there for popular consumption. And they're incredibly active during the Second World War as soon as it starts in publishing numbers. Before the war even ends, they're putting out, comparisons to other groups, and they're publishing things, as soon as they have information to constantly combat these assumptions. But by the end of the Second World War, even though that image has been kind of corrected somewhat, not entirely, two new images of kind of Jewish male archetypes really emerge. One of them is the living skeleton, the Holocaust survivor. So Jews may have started to present as more manly because of their participation in the war, because of their fighting in Palestine. But at the end of the war, you see all of the images that are being circulated internationally of Jewish men, they don't look very strong, right? The images of survivors, of corpses, so that wizened survivor kind of depresses the arguable growth of the male image. And the other is exactly the opposite. It's the image of the Sabra. So the born in Mandate Palestine, raised in the Holy Land, tan, muscled, working the land Jews. And that brings us back to the discussion of Zionism too, which really starts early on. So I have, as Ronnie pointed out, which I hadn't thought about because you don't read your book for a long time from the point where you're done writing it to the point where it's come out. There are 3 different chapters in this book that focus on Zionism. And the earlier ones are really about the development of that image and how Jewish men in Palestine were perceived by Zionists abroad.
And there really was this desire to make a new Jew, a new muscle Jew. I mean, that's part of the Zionist project that's explicit in their writing.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And what's really fascinating is that it becomes a very American project. And what I mean by that is it's not just Jews who are, jumping on the Zionist bandwagon and supporting Jews in Palestine. It's Americans, American government officials, millenarians, so Christians who believe, different sects of Christianity that believe that Jews have to go back to Palestine in order for the second coming. So there's a whole lot of different people that support this for a variety of reasons. But one of the most interesting things that sources that I think I found in the early studies is the Anglo-American Jewish Committee, which was a committee put together of British and American journalists and politicians who went and kind of looked at the Yeshuv, at pre-state Jewish settlements in Palestine. And what they came back saying was really remarkable. and a lot of it quite outlandish. So they wrote that not only were Jews returning to a more muscular and wholesome form. They talked about Jews being, standing straighter and appearing taller and being stronger and connected to the land. But they said not only that, they were also, they were becoming so strong that their hair was getting blonder and their eyes were becoming bluer. So they were not just curing themselves of emasculation, they were curing themselves of ethnicity, is what they argued, which of course is not true. This is all just perception. But they, these Americans came back and said, you know what this is happening, the Zionist movement in Palestine? It's an American project. This is what we did in America. We conquered the land, we conquered its inhabitants.
We were cowboys, right?
We were cowboys, we were pioneers, and they came back saying what we see happening there is a new America in the Middle East. And that really resonated with a lot of American Jews who were trying so hard to attain masculinity by American means. It was saying not only is this possible in America, it's possible to replicate America for Jews elsewhere. So this is a way to absolutely attain this kind of strength and masculine identity. So at the end of the Second World War, in this kind of watershed moment, when this, the image of the Sabra becomes so popular and the state is officially declared, and then the war is won, the war for Israeli independence, perspectives on Zionism in the United States change pretty dramatically. And until the last decade, scholars really argued that there was, not so much talk about the Holocaust, or, not as much talk about this kind of reclamation of Jewish identity until after the '67 war, but I think that has completely been disproven. Because people are immediately talking about these competing images of the survivor and the Sabra. They just weren't doing it in those terms.
Okay. So going a little bit more forward with the story, I think some of your most fascinating chapters are on the 1960s. And if anything, the 1960s are a moment of sort of fracture in what, what America's about, but also in terms of masculinity broadly. And so what's the Jewish story in the 1960s? Because one of the interesting things that you talk about and that other scholars have mentioned is that Jews were sort of disproportionately involved with the social movements of that period, and that there's a gendered story to tell there, which you do in your book. And you can choose any of the multiple examples. And I want to emphasize that one of the things that's amazing about Miriam's book is if you just think about this broad sweep, like the evidence that she found and that she scoped out at different archives to construct this argument is like wide-ranging. I wanted to say that earlier. But thinking about the 1960s, I thought one of the most fascinating discussions she had was of the Chicago 8, which was the trial of anti-war new leftist yippies after demonstrating at Chicago in '68. They were arrested and they become the Chicago 7. And I'll stop talking about it because I'm going to let you tell the story, because Miriam makes a really convincing argument that that's a Jewish story.
Thanks. So the 60s are this point of dramatic fracture in like every way imaginable. But I talk a lot about 1968 specifically because after that, I had to stop the book in '73 because gender and notions of gender fracture dramatically, right? And it becomes really difficult to trace these varying threads. But one of the things that's happening in the 1960s is as Jews are disproportionately participating in the civil rights movement and anti-war protest and campus protest, what we see is Jewish men, as I demonstrate they do throughout the book, trying to attain mainstream masculinity in different ways. But what we see is a competing masculinity in their fellow protesters, primarily in Black nationalists and among the Panthers, and they try and emulate this. And we see that in a number of different ways. So in the book, I talk about, and I will talk about the Chicago 7 in a second, but I talk about the JDL and their kind of mimicry of Black Panthers, which is really heavy-handed, I think, and obvious. But how masculine that is, but also how Jewish protesters really look to Black nationalists and emulate them and try to connect their struggles.
I'll just say that's such an interesting story too, because so much of the book is about attaining kind of white standards of masculinity, and then you've got this sort of shift in the 60s, which just shows how, I think, disruptive that decade was to notions of masculinity and which masculinity one aspired to.
Yeah, and Black masculinity, and I published an article about this some time ago, but it's also racism against African Americans is also incredibly gendered, but it makes the exact opposite argument that anti-Semitism makes about Jewish men, right? It's more, the kind of racist assumptions are, that they're more masculine, more bestial, or but in the campus protest movement, I talk about the Weathermen and Mark Rudd and the 1968 protests on Columbia campus and how they tried so hard to form this partnership with the Black Panthers and the Black nationalists and SNCC on campus, and how resistant Black nationalists were to this connection. You are not part of our struggle. You are not and the different terms at the time, but you are not a fellow person of color, right? This is not the same struggle. So we see the same thing happening off campuses, like in the Chicago 7 trial, which started as the Chicago 8 trial, which was, for those of you who don't know, the massive protests outside of the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago saw
happening
the arrest
again this year.
Yeah, I know. Same place. Yeah, and lots of terrifying parallels. Yes. I've been thinking about that a lot. But we see 8 people arrested, all men, as leaders of the protest movement, and they're arrested on conspiracy charges and charges with intent to begin or to incite a riot. And one of those is Bobby Seale of the Black Panthers. And he's pretty quickly removed from the courtroom and removed from the trial. He had insisted on his own representation. This was a very big part of the Panthers, is that they had studied law, that they knew their rights. And in this case, he had his own lawyer who then got sick and had to go in for emergency surgery. And so he said that he needed his own attorney or to exercise his right to represent himself. And the judge of that case, Judge Julius Hoffman, refused to let him and ended up having him bound and gagged and then removed from the court and having his, he was removed. And it became the Chicago 7. And at that point, I argue, the story becomes a Jewish story. So until then, the rest of the accused, the Chicago 7, had really been looking to Bobby Seale and taking their cues from him. They were willing to have his lawyer representing them, and the Jewishness hadn't really kind of become such a big part of the story. But once he's gone, the spectacle of this trial really focuses on Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, who are the leaders of the Yippie Party, which were just absurdists.
Youth International Party.
The Youth International Party, the Yippies, yeah. And I argue that this is a really Jewish story, not just because the players are so largely Jewish. The judge, Julius Hoffman, is Jewish. Of the 7 defendants, 3 are Jewish. Of the 2 defending attorneys, both are Jewish. Of the prosecuting attorneys, 1 of 2 is Jewish. So 7 of the 12 people involved in this trial are Jewish. They're all men. There are no women except for a stenographer, and 10 of the jurors. So, and the jury selection in this was very complicated too, and also very gendered. A lot of the questions that were asked by the defense attorneys to try and get jurors thrown out were things like, do you think that a man is less of a man for refusing to fight and for protesting the war? So this is a really gendered trial to begin with. And then it has this Jewish presence, not just because so many of the people are Jewish, but because Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman brought Jewishness to the fore. So, for example, when they showed up very famously in judges' robes to mock the judge, Judge Hoffman, they also affixed yellow stars to the judges' robes. And there was this constant bringing up of the Holocaust and comparing this court and the Jewish establishment to perpetrators of the Holocaust. So it's really like a generational war being played out between the old left and the new left in this courtroom, and done in a very Jewish way, sometimes even in Yiddish, right? At one point, Abby Hoffman, tells Julius Hoffman, "You're a shanda for de goyim," right? You're a shame in front of the Gentiles, or you shame us. And at one point, there was a lot of spectacle that's very fun to talk about, so I could go on about that for quite some time. But he uses this connection, Abby Hoffman and Julius Hoffman, the judge, not just because their names are so Jewish.
And the same.
And what? And the same, right? And the same name. But he also, he mocks him and his name. At one point, he threatens to legally change his first name to Fuck, so that every time they address him, they're saying Fuck Hoffman. Lots of things like that. And he also says he's going to change his last name back to Shaboiznikov, I want to say, which he says that Hoffman is his slave name, which I do not think he would have said with Bobby Seale in the room. But you see a lot of this kind of playing out. So, the chapter goes in much, much more detail, not just about the Chicago 7, but how all of this is kind of playing out in the protest movement. So this becomes this very public spectacle, which is a demonstration of something that's really happening in a lot of places. It's happening on campuses across the country. It's happening in protest movements where Jewish men are, and I argue largely at the expense of Jewish women in the movement, which is one of the reasons I think so many Jewish women kind of exited the anti-war protest movement and moved into feminist protests, as they were so kind of abused by the Jewish men in the movement, which they wrote about later, like Jerry Rubin wrote about this later. But they're engaging with this very masculine struggle to identify as these parallel leaders to Black nationalists.
Yeah, and I think the 60s is so complicated in some ways, and I think this is another area where Miriam's book does such a good job kind of introducing a topic, but there's so much more to be done, in the sense that, I think lots of people have recognized that Jews were overly involved with the social movements of the 1960s, but it's very difficult to sort of, they didn't talk about it at the time, or at least a lot of them didn't, though it was interesting that Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin during the trial did make it explicit. So that's why your story was so convincing, but I think in thinking about this gets to a question we sort of talked about. I skipped a couple questions, so I'm gonna do one from the beginning and one from the end, which is, if we were gonna have a next book on American Jewish masculinity, what would it be? And then the other question, and the second question I wanted to ask is maybe it's related to where the next book would be, in the sense of like what you couldn't do and what we can't do, because a book has to be finished. And take it from someone who took a very long time to finish a book. It is like a child. You said it was like a child. It's like birthing a child, and it never feels like it's quite ready, and then you have to like push it out into the world. So what would the next book on American Jewish masculinity, what should it be? And then another question is maybe thinking about how your book began, and how you came to write this book, and how did the story maybe change over time, or what was the most surprising? So there are two different questions.
Well, I will say, whatever the next book on Jewish masculinity is, I'm not going to write it. I think one is enough. But I think I focus, like I said, on a very narrow band, right, on these upwardly mobile, middle-class acculturating Jews. I think that there are brands of masculinity. There are these strands, threads of masculine identity or variant masculine identities that I think are very deserving of their own study. I think just as I argue that anti-Semitism is really gendered, I also think that we are due a book on homophobia and anti-Semitism and the ways that they've crossed over and continue to cross over, and how much homophobia is threaded through anti-Semitic rhetoric that targets Jewish men. I think that would be a really fascinating study that someone else should do. I also think that there's recently been a couple of books that touch on Israeli masculinity, and I think that I don't know what's available in Hebrew, but I do think that more books on variant masculinities in Israel would be very fascinating, but it's not my area. And as far as, how I kind of came to this, and we've touched on it a bit, it's really, I came to, if you read the book, it opens and closes with culture studies. It opens with Dr. Zoidberg from Futurama, and it closes with the Bear Jew from Inglourious Bastards. And the reason for that is that that's kind of the book I set out to write initially, is I wanted to do a cultural study, and I started reading what was out there, and it was all based on these assumptions about what Jewish men are, with absolutely, and I don't mean this to insult the people who've written on it before, because they were writing from different historical disciplines, or different disciplines that aren't history. But there was no basis, no provable basis. What were Jewish men actually doing? Were Jewish men actually weaker? Were Jewish men actually malingering? And were Jewish men actually not involved in sports? None of that's true, but people still believed it.
And some people had those perceptions at the time, which are motivating the actors that you talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's really, that's as far as like the sources I look at, and the reason I ended up in immigration history instead of cultural studies, which is where I thought I was going with it, is that it really kind of, the story started to really tell itself as this struggle, this continuing struggle to attain something American, or, put in other words, an acceptance of these assumptions about Jewish men. Jewish men themselves saying, yes, these things are true, but they're fixable, and the cure is America. And here's how becoming American can fix our ills.
So fix ills like being weak or prone too much to studying, though you do make the distinction in the book that Jews are never sort of wanting to get rid of that scholarly tradition or that intellectual tradition, but they're trying to also merge it with an American ideas of masculinity, right? Of physical toughness and athleticism. I mean, these are things that come really dominant at the turn of the early 20th century.
Yeah, that Anglo-American Committee on Palestine there was a great quote from one of the journalists who was there who said that you could see these, strapping, muscular young men, like their, skin glinting in the sunlight as they shattered rocks, with their muscles while discussing Strindberg, which is just perfect.
Maybe one last question, and then we can open it to to questions. But one last thing, which is related. Was there anything really surprising? Put you on the spot because we didn't talk about that before.
Yeah, I think what was really surprising to me, and this is something that Sarah Imhoff's book, which came out in the midst of my book, which was both a gift and
horrifying,
and a bit horrifying,
because when you think you're writing someone and then something, and then someone else, beats you to it. Though your books ended up being very different.
Very different, yeah, thank goodness. And her book is wonderful. And one of the things that her book helped me realize, I think, but also, just the sources that I found very surprising, is just how important small groups of men were on the periphery in this kind of change of Jewish, groups like the early revisionist Zionists, and then the Committee for a Free Palestine in America, and the JDL, small fringe groups that I think really had a much bigger impact. I don't want to say than they had any right to, but I mean a much bigger impact than you would think. And same, I think, goes for the influence on Jewish masculinity of groups that weren't particularly Jewish, like Students for a Democratic Society, which was disproportionately Jewish but not statedly Jewish, and then the Weathermen, which was also, this terrorist group, which was also largely Jewish.
Yeah, it was. And I'll just say, thinking about small groups, we're on a Facebook group called Jewish Academic Mamas. It's the best
We're moms.
It's the best group on the internet. It's like a kind, wonderful space where you can kvetch or get advice. And so I remember Miriam, when she was doing the cover of the book, I'm not going to talk about the whole cover, but what I do remember is that, isn't this a family photo?
It is.
Can you tell us a little bit about that, and then we'll open it up to questions? Because thinking about just small groups making a big impact, that's what I would say.
Yeah. Well, the upper left in the glasses with the striped shirt is my great grandfather, Ezra Sensabar, and I in my first career I was a photographer. before I became a historian, and I set about digitizing all of these old negatives in my family. So I have this just treasure trove of wonderful photographs. I wanted to use a family photo because I think Ezra was this. Ezra passed when I was 3, I think. Ezra Sensabar. But
Very good name.
It's a
I
great
love
name.
it.
And he really kind of embodies so much of the story that I've told, in that he was scholarly. He owned a construction lands. I don't know. Looking at my mother like she's going to yell out an answer. It's fine. But as I'm like telling this story, I feel like so much of it has been played out in my family, in the story of immigration and acculturation and maintaining, becoming American while maintaining so much Jewishness and Jewish culture, even if the religion part didn't stay in as much. But the reason I love this picture so much is that it's a bunch of Jewish men all wearing different hats. And I think that really kind of covers it. Because the other pictures that I was talking about with the publisher, they all try, like a picture of a Jewish soldier would tell the wrong story. And a picture of a Jewish scholar would tell the wrong story. And this book, really, the goal of the book is to show the diversity of Jewish masculinities, and how changeable and malleable they are, and how that influence is both from within and without. And that's probably a good note
to open up to questions.
If anyone has it. There's a microphone, I think.
Misperceptions and images. And one of them is the scholarly, meek, scrawny Jew who puts on a military uniform, and that image is gone. But once the war is over and he sheds the uniform, he's back to what he was. And who would know that he was even a soldier? So there's a lot of times when we're faced with the question of either or. Either he's one or the other in this particular case. And the answer very often is both. Yep. That scholar, that meek-looking person, now he might not have been a hero in a war, but he fulfilled his obligation, he did his duty. So it's not one or the other. So that's a misperception. And who would even know that? When he's not in uniform, and as you mentioned, who would know? He's back to that scrawny Jew.
Yeah, so I think a lot of the Jewish war veterans are a great source for this, because they talk about this, what happens when men come home, and how they themselves change, and the ways that the Jewish war veterans then kind of publicize not just their successes, but what they do after.
So they carry themselves differently.
And
of their experiences of the war. So even though they're carrying, so they might be going back to being the scholar, you're right, but there's a shift in how they're perceived because they've contributed to this war effort. And that shift in perception from other people seeing Jews differently, I think then it impacts how Jews see themselves. So it's this like kind of, because you come back and you're like, I wasn't denied the military. In Europe, sometimes they were denied being able to join, or they were drafted in Russia, I think, to lose their Jewish identity, and they would be drafted for like 30 years. So to come back, I think it changes how others see Jews and then how they see themselves. Well, I mean, I don't know about World War I, but I think World War II, there were so many films and, even Norman Mailer's novel that's talking about like when you're in the military, you see your brothers and those hatreds kind of go around. And I think there was this sense that Jews proved themselves, especially in World War II. I don't know as much about World War I. I'll let Miriam.
I'll actually talk less about the soldiers and more about what they did in the U.S. I mean, it was one of the things that I talk about is the ways that Jews present themselves. So I think one of the kind of interesting pieces, especially around athletics, is that Jewish men, they did not just internalize these perceptions of Jewish men as weak or scrawny or whatever, but those that accepted it kind of went in one of two ways, right? Either they said these things are true.
But we can
And we are weak,
overcome
but we
them
can fix them.
by-
So we're going to found athletic societies. We're going to
Go to
start camping
camps.
movements. We're going to make our own fraternities and engage in sportsmanship. Or they said, these things are pervasive. People believe them, but they're not true. So we need to prove they're not true so that we don't need to change our bodies. We just need to show people we can do this.
Though
And so I
there's-
talk about both of those in the book.
And you talk about one more thing, which is with basketball, and I have this in my book too, this is why I know, with basketball was considered a Jewish sport in the early decades of the 20th century, and anti-Semites, and sometimes Jews even took this, said that Jews were particularly good at basketball because
They were so crafty.
they were so crafty. They thought a lot. Right? This is a game
It's a
that
quick thinking
requires
game.
thinking. And so it's got, there's an anti-Semitic, obviously, component, but then there's also some pride that you can take from that. And that's it's in both of our books. And I'll say that my book I'll just give a short plug, looks
Her
at the
book's
New York,
great.
looks at the New York intellectuals, which is a famous group of intellectuals who are sort of very famous in the middle of the 20th century, but are coming of age in the same time that Miriam's talking about early in her book. And I make the argument that they take American notions of masculinity about physical strength and combativeness, and they apply it to the intellectual vocation. And they sort of construct a new kind of secular Jewish masculinity that's focused on the intellectual, that has these connections to sort of the Talmudic scholar, but there's something specifically about American of it because they're growing up on the streets, wanting to Americanize, wanting to be seen as tough. And they end up, I think some of them actually don't, a lot of them evaded World War II, and they later regret that. They see that as something, like they didn't want to go fight. They were scared, is the honest truth, for good reason. Or Irving Howe was sent up to Alaska, and he was very happy he was sent to Alaska because he didn't have to actually fight, and he read there. But, but they come, and so some of them regret not serving later on, which is interesting. And then a younger one, Norman Podhoretz, who's famous as the editor of Commentary, he serves, and he talks a lot about how when he served in Korea, he was weak compared to everyone else, but he found out he was a really good soldier because he was smart. And he becomes like the teacher about communism. And so he sees his experience in the military as masculinizing, even though he sort of feels inferior to his non-Jewish people, but it becomes masculinizing because he proves his intellectual chops. So it's like combining both. So you're right, it's never like one or the other, and these things are always in conversation.
I was saying to someone earlier, after starting Ronnie's book, that it's, you can so clearly see in these moments when several books come out about a topic, there must have been something that came out that kind of set us both on this path. But it's because they come out around the same time. Her book came out in March.
Though I started mine like 10 years before, and it took me a really long time. Too long.
I just pushed mine out before it was ready. Is what but I really think that my book would have benefited from Ronnie's, and vice versa, because hers really, this argument about intellectuals and the kind of shift from what I would call, real life masculinity to masculinity in prose is incredibly convincing and fascinating, and explains, I think, a lot of what we think of as Jewish voice. So please read her book also.
But I think then also but it's contested always. What does it mean to be masculine, and is this a positive thing? I think that's something else that we see in both of our works, and that becomes increasingly, I think, dominant in the 1960s when I think younger activists are questioning the masculinity of their fathers, and so it's contested and fracturing. It's not like, that's why it's hard to write about masculinity because it's not this like tangible thing.
Some men don't like it,
which we've both discovered.
Hi, love the book. So I was wondering, though, the extent to which what you're talking about with Jewish masculinity is also an example of a larger phenomenon with modernity, and that Jews are often kind of the canary in the coal mine when it comes to anxieties of modernity, and the extent to which you can connect what you're talking about to, say, late Victorian muscular Christianity, and that in fact so many of these movements that they're tapping into, like athleticism, scouting, and so on and so forth, are based on a perception that for some reason boys are no longer manly enough, and we have to do something about it. For the Europeans, it's maybe a downfall from a manliness, and for the Jews, maybe it's moving on up. But at some point, they seem to be coming together.
Yeah, that's that's a great point. A lot of sociologists who have written about masculinity talk about this crisis of masculinity at the end, during the First World War. And I think it's funny. I hadn't thought of it that way, although that kind of opposite trajectory. It makes me wonder if anyone actually actively thought in the earliest 20th century that masculinity was failing because Jews were attaining it.
I think they did, because I think part of muscular
interesting.
Christianity is a response to mass immigration. It's the response to the great migration of African Americans moving from the South to the North, and this idea that white Protestant masculinity is under attack, and so we need to strengthen it for ourselves so that we're like not taken over by the other.
Yeah, I think there's a big difference between, muscular Christianity and muscular Judaism, in that muscular Judaism is so tied to Zionism.
They're developing it. Well, I guess it's Zion. Well, they're developing almost around the same time, actually.
But this one, muscular Christianity is tied to the religion, and muscular Judaism is really tied to the political movement of muscular Zionism. Through Max Nordau and this kind of, it's tied to these Victorian notions of gender, and that gender is connected to the land and the state. And in Germany, it's Volkish ideology, right? Like the connection of the Volk to the land. So Germans are from a place with lush green forests and mountains, so they're a strong kind of industrious people. This is like that, right? God knows. And Jews are a landless people, right? So this is in like Volkish ideology and Nazi rhetoric, right? That because Jews have no land, or because they're historically from a desert, they are dry and barren and soulless people. And I think that one of the kind of motivations of muscular Zionism comes out of that assumption, right? And that really like dominant view of Jews as landless and therefore disconnected to nationhood, which is so closely tied in to perceptions of masculinity. The state and manhood are so tied together. And if they're, if Jews are considered outsiders in every country that they reside in Europe, they're never going to achieve that. So they never came close. They developed these entire different forms of masculinity and ideals of masculinity. But muscular Zionism is really that opportunity, right? And this is no revelation. Like Nordau clearly wrote about this. Herzl clearly wrote about this, that this is the opportunity for Jews to be parallel on the global stage with other men and other nations. Questions? Yeah.
Sports, such as being baseball fans, football fans, being in the stadium, as opposed to being players?
That's a really, really interesting question. And there are actually a couple of books that have come out about Jews and sport. I think there's one called Baseballs and Matzo Balls.
But that's a good title.
It's a great title.
title.
Great title.
I mean,
but there are. I did not include that, like fandom, and I think that's. I also think this is an area that people are just starting to really consider as worthy of scholarly attention. Like in the comics world, like comics fandom as being something worth studying, and I think sports fans are definitely up there. In like, there's. I think. I had not thought about this, so I really appreciate the question because I think it's fascinating, and I know so many Jewish baseball fans and collectors of cars, and that it was a real boys' activity. So I don't know the answer to your question or if it's ever been written about, but it's fascinating.
I write about it a little bit in the sense that the New York intellectuals, when they talk about growing up in the neighborhoods around New York City, in the Bronx and in the Lower East Side and in Harlem, for them, sports were central, and the development of games like stickball. There's a bunch of them. I can't remember them. I don't have my book right, but there were all these different versions of baseball that they started to play in the streets because they didn't have space for a big baseball diamond, and so you would it would be between two buildings, and that becoming fans of baseball in particular. I think football less, at least in this early period. It might be later. I don't write about football, but I think that idea of becoming fans of sports is integral to the masculinization process, because definitely for the New York intellectuals, and Eliot Cohen, who is the first editor of Commentary magazine, which was founded by the American Jewish Committee in 1945, he has a special section that he devotes kind of to talking about Jews doing, being not playing sports and also being fans of sports. So I think that that's an integral part of the story, and I think that many people who grew up in immigrant neighborhoods, that would resonate, and that there's definitely something there.
And coming back to anti-Semitism being gendered and masculinity, I will say I have read several statements, I've run across several times where people say that Jews love baseball because there's so much math involved, and that Jews love statistics because there is so much math involved, and that Jews disliked football because it was the Christian sport.
Well, wasn't football invented kind of as to be a WASP? I mean, I don't know. It was invented as Harvard and Yale, partly at this moment to distinguish white Protestant men from others. I mean, I think it was developed in many, I'm not a sports historian, but I think it was developed very much as a sport for the white Protestant elite at Harvard and Yale.
Yeah.
Where Jews couldn't go by the early 20th century because there's quotas. Deliberately targeting them because too many Jews from Eastern Europe were getting admission, and they're gonna
start arguing in the cafeteria.
Start arguing, and overwhelm the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant elite. So in this moment where Jews are, aspiring for American masculinity, they're facing a really difficult, world, because there's some people. I was surprised. Teddy Roosevelt in her book, she talks about how Teddy Roosevelt believes that Jews can attain this masculinity, but on the other hand, I think there's a lot of white Americans who are constructing this kind of masculinity that. Because they see it as exclusive, other groups don't have it, including Jews. Any more questions? That's why they took up. The quotes on basketball are amazing about how they're smart.
They took up basketball because they're quick thinking, and it's a very smart sport.
And Jews were also boxers. So that's a celebrated sport at the beginning. That Jews dominated that sport. It was initially dominated by the Irish. It wasn't illegal prize fighting, but Jews.
Quite a bit about that in here too.
You write about that too. They grew up in tough. And boxing was a way to get out of the streets, to make money for their families. Some of the earliest silent films, I'm forgetting the one, I show it in one of my classes, but it's a story about an immigrant son who becomes a boxer.
Although I will say,
not Golden Boy. If it came to me, I would remember it. It'll come in a minute. But it's and it's about his. It's a story about generational conflict, about what it means to be a man, and a younger generation aspiring to be to be American.
But I will say that a lot of the Jewish boxers changed their names so as not to embarrass and disappoint their Jewish mothers. Yes. So this is the rhetoric that people are writing about them with at the time. It's yes, they're very strong, but boy, do they love their mamas. Is still in there. And it's the same with Jewish criminals and Jewish boy gangs and things like that. They constantly have this in there. And I know we've run over. So I think we should probably.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks, Miriam.
Thank you, Ronnie.